On this episode of Straight Outta Gabriola, we're going deep into the island's geology with Nick Doe. Nick is one of Gabriola's go-to sources for the island's geological history. For almost 2 decades, he wrote and edited Shale, which is a journal of all things historical for the Gabriola Museum. Naturally, he had a slight editorial tilt towards articles about rocks. Now, you might catch a glimpse of Nick walking the beaches and the forests of the island. You will know him by his professorial, meditative stride, bespeckled with a grizzled beard, strolling slowly along, deep in contemplation, usually wearing an old sweater or a raincoat, and a hammer, pickaxe, and a field guide of one sort or the other always in his pockets. Though he formerly studied and had a long career as an electronics engineer, his scientific explorations of the Earth's deep history was an all-consuming fascination, almost an obsession of his since boyhood, growing up in County Berkshire in the UK. When he moved to Gabriola in the late 1990s with his partner Jenny, he picked up where he left off in England, exploring the cliff faces and beaches of the island and reading and researching all he could about this island's geological story. I was hoping to call this episode Nick Doe's Top 5 Geological Wonders of Gabriola, but in his typically Nick fashion, he gently turned down that suggestion, replying, "Well, that's a bit like asking, what do you prefer, ice cream or roast beef and Yorkshire pudding? How can you choose? It depends on so many things." So instead, I asked Nick, just let's pick some spots and let's go see them, and you can explain what we're looking at and why they are so fascinating. So over 2 afternoons in early June, I met up with Nick and we went rockin'. At our first stop, the shore and cliff line below the cemetery, Nick gives an overview of the formation and types of depositions that make up Gabriola. And here's a fun fact. You may know, but I sure didn't, that Vancouver Island and all the coastal archipelago islands along the entire BC coast, including Haida Gwaii, all originated volcanically, far off in the South Pacific a couple of 100 million years ago. Then they lollygagged along on tectonic drift, sliding northeastward until they finally crunched up against the coast of BC around 90 million years ago, give or take a few months accounting for leap years. Now, you can't get any more islanderish than that.
You know, there are 4 formations on Gabriola, and this is the oldest. It's the Northumberland Formation, and it's, as you see, it's mud rock. Mm-hmm. But the geologically, Gabriola sits on everything has been folded here, you know, and geologically, Gabriola sits in what we call a syncline. That's you know,
kind of a saddle-y.
The downward slope of the fold, you know. And so the oldest rocks appear at the edges, at the surface. We're looking at one edge here, and these rocks dive down deep under Gabriola, but they reappear on Whalebone Beach.
Yeah.
They're exactly the same age, and that's a better place, actually, to find ammonites.
Right.
So it's a mirror image of the actual topography.
Right.
And then the rocks will dip up, and these are even older rocks over here. Mm-hmm. We have 4 formations, but there are actually about 11 formations in total on the Nanaimo group. And they're all sediments formed when Vancouver Island arrived, basically, pushed here on tectonic plates, you know, from the Pacific Ocean. Mm-hmm. Vancouver Island arrived about 90 million years ago, something like that. And it was probably underwater at the time. But the continent, North America, was moving westward as the Atlantic Ocean was being created at that time and was pushing westward. And so there was a bit of a collision, and that's when the Coast Mountains grew and the Vancouver Island Mountains grew. And the weight of these mountains kept this area depressed. So there's the Georgia Depression runs all the way up to Alaska, and it's basically depressed because of the weight of the mountains on both sides. So this one's interesting because when my wife first came here, Jenny, she asked somebody, well, are there any fossils on Gabriola? And and the guy looked down. He says, "You're standing on them. all these things are fossils. The biodiversity, as it were, was pretty limited. We think what happened at the time. We'll look at the fossils a bit closer in a minute. But it was a very stagnant end water. The Strait of Juan de Fuca didn't exist, and so it was a very narrow backwater and very, very stagnant, probably. Right. And the mud, just stagnant mud. And so there are a few fossils that live here, but the most common one by far were these giant oysters. Some people call them giant clams, but that gets paleontologists a bit annoyed because they're actually oysters. There's typically one, a remain of one, the shell of one.
Right, yes. So just looking at a slight kind of polished depression of a different kind of a texture and color, and you can tell
here's one. It's more clearly a shell. It's got the nacreous look to it.
Yes.
And these things apparently lived on the surface of the mud, which is another indication it was probably very stagnant water, because that means if there were predators around, they would have been they couldn't bury themselves. They were some of them are like dinner plates. These are small guys. There are aniceramids, they call them, and there are species in Greenland which were 6 feet. Big guys. And so then, what's interesting about this side is the way they got buried, because the shells are pretty common, but these nodules, these things, scattered around here.
Yeah, so the little round...
mystery. Well, what the heck are these? And normally, some people call them concretions, but that's wrong. Even geologists, they're nodules. Their basic structure. Let's crack one open.
Sure. Yeah, and they obviously look different from the cobblestone beaches over on... It's a whole different rock, sedimentary rock that we're looking at.
Now, you can open up hundreds of these, which I probably have done in my lifetime, and expecting to see a nice fossil inside, and you never ever do. So the question is, what is this, and what are all the... it's clearly,
so some formation or some contours.
So anyway, if you analyze this, you find what it is mainly calcite, which indicates that's calcium carbonate. It is a fossil, and mixed with a little mud. Montmorillonite is a clay mixture, but it's got nothing to do with the mud rock itself. So. Finally came to the conclusion that what these are is it's the soft tissue of these clams that they must have suddenly got buried, and this is what remains, the soft tissue of the clams. Now, question 2 is, well, what are all these trails that you see here? Well, the secret there is that these guys were living at a sandbank on an estuary in a river, rather like the sandbanks, Roberts Banks.
Right, yes. Yeah.
It wouldn't have been the Fraser River, it's too long ago, but a very similar river coming from the coast mountains. And this would have been some way away from the sandbanks, because it's mud, which is a very, very fine material, so it drifts out further. But periodically, an earthquake or just overload, the sandbanks would collapse and send a wave of sand over the seafloor, which would bury these guys, and they didn't have any ability to get themselves out, so they all died. And which is why you got they come in one strata. There was something suddenly happened. And you can see the layers in here.
When we look at the cliff here below the cemetery, we can see them poking out there in little spots all the way along.
But they're layers, which means that it was a very sudden event of some kind that killed them. Now, it being stagnant, the other element in these things was sulfur. There's quite a lot of sulfide, and it so happens that calcium sulfide makes sulfates, and because there's a lot of calcium, it makes calcium sulfate, which is otherwise known as gypsum, which is otherwise known as plaster of Paris. Okay, so put this together, you've got plaster of Paris here in this mass of organic material which is rotting away, and as the plaster of Paris sets, it expands slightly, and makes a cast. Mm-hmm. So what you've got here is a cast of the mass of organic material, which is totally vanished now, of course, chemically. Yeah. But what you've got here is a plaster of Paris cast of the hull, which was the soft material of these giant clams. So these things are just either worms or wormy hulls or what the heck they are. Nobody knows, Yeah. But they were the guys that were in the mud feeding on these buried clams. And unfortunately, the original innards of oysters, I should call them, is vanished, so we don't know very much about them.
In an earlier episode of this podcast series, we went on a dig at Brickyard Beach with Thomas Harding and Elizabeth Beale. The episode was called Clam Dig, of course, and it's remarkable when you think how many thousands of years Coast Salish peoples have harvested on a shoreline that even through all the changes over the eons continues to be a productive shellfish habitat. Next up, the cliffs along Eastham Road at Descanso Bay.
These rocks in a scientific fashion, look at them, and came so often, just peer at them or correct my writing about them. But now they're like old friends. I mean, it's a different relationship. I no longer look at them as I wonder what that is or whatever. They're just old friends. They're rocks. I know the. Yeah. I've known these for 65 million years.
So here we are along Eastham Road, and this is quite an impressive cliff.
This sandstone here is the youngest. This is the Gabriola Formation. And its actual date is a little uncertain because fossils are very, very rare, or datable fossils anyway, in the Gabriola Formation. So we're really not quite sure how young these rocks are. And it's just possible that they actually include the KT boundary. That's the end of the dinosaur era when a massive meteorite hit the Earth, and that was. And it's possible that these rocks are, that was around 65 million years ago. But nobody has found any concrete evidence for that yet.
To pinpoint it within this sandstone.
but it is undated. The youngest rocks here. And now this is sort of interesting because these different formations. There was some discussion, and this would be in the 1970s, as to what these different formations actually mean, and why did it suddenly change from sand to this is mud rock here? This is the spray formation
at the very low level here by the road. Okay.
That's shale.
Yeah.
And the theory in the 1970s was that it was sea level changes. The sea retreated, and so there was less sand, but more very, very fine mud seeping into the water. But that was all blown out of the water in the 1990s when it was discovered that all of these rocks are marine rocks. They all formed.
Mm-hmm. Hello there. Hi.
Hello. Several hundred meters deep. And they were, like I was saying at the cemetery, they were formed at the estuary of a river. Like the sand, this would have been like Roberts Bank and so on. The sandstone here, I'm pointing at the Gabriola Formation.
So that the whole great alluvial kind of formation from sand and in a river delta.
These rocks, these are the mud rocks. These would be formed some distance away from the estuary. It was only when the very, very fine stuff was drifted out, and it drifts quite a long way into the Georgia Strait, and settles and forms the mud rock. And now the belief is that this change came about with the change in the course of the major rivers that were supplying this sediment. It's easy to think of the Fraser River, but it was not the Fraser River in those days. And then something happened in the mountains, over time. The course of the river changed, and all of a sudden we were right bang close to the estuary of the river.
And then started depositing sand.
Sand, yeah. And even above sand, of course, if you get even nearer to the estuary, you get a rock called conglomerate, which you do get on Gabriola too, which are pebbles and rocks, brought down by the creeks and things. The bigger the particle size, the closer you are to the river, the mouth of the river.
Merely mentioning conglomerate had Nick all charged up to show me an example of that. And so we... wait a minute here. Hey there, Google, evil empire and master of all that we know. Can you tell me, where can I find conglomerate rocks?
According to ThoughtCo, conglomerate rock occurs where gravel can become rounded by traveling distances or being subjected to tumbling. Beaches, riverbeds, and glaciers can produce conglomerate. The properties of conglomerate rock depend on its composition. It can be found in any color and may be either hard or soft.
So with the thrill of discovery and adventure, we raced off. The wind at our backs, hiking to parts remote and unknown, braving the dangerous rash of wild cars and trucks, racing for the ferry. Here we are, on the roadside of Brickyard Hill.
You can look at the way the sand is laid down, to figure out which direction the river was flowing. And the conglomerate of the Gabriola Formation actually peaks in Hornby Island. So the river was, somewhere up at it was not the Fraser River, clearly.
Right, and not the Howe Sound one that you talked about earlier.
No, it was way up north.
Right.
But the other way of approaching it, of course, is to look at the different kinds of rocks there are. And conglomerate is when the entrance to the sea from the rivers and creeks and things is very precipitous and very close. So you've got rocks tumbling down from the streams, and they're always very well-rounded rocks, meaning they've been in a creek or stream or river.
To polish them and round them, right.
Yeah. And the mainstream theory is that these actually came from the San Juan Islands, which sounds a bit in contradiction to the Hornby theory. My favourite theory is that the San Juan Island theory is maybe wrong, and but there are small pockets of these kinds of rocks in the coast mountains, but they're very small and they're very inaccessible, and one person has researched them in 10 years or 20 years, and you can only get in by a helicopter and whatever. So that makes more sense to me, but we don't know. So it's a short answer.
And as you say, it was the study of the deposition of the sands that you can kind of get an idea of what direction
you can get the flow patterns.
Pattern.
Yeah.
Right.
One of the interesting things about the San Juan Islands is that they're geologic. That's the borderline between the political borderline between Canada and the U.S. through the Canadian Gulf Islands and the San Juans. Almost exactly coincides with the geological boundary.
Isn't that something?
And the San Juans are totally different rocks from the Canadian Gulf Islands. They're very complicated. The San Juans were being formed at a time when the Pacific Plate subduction zone would have been on this side of Vancouver Island. Now it's way out off the west coast. But there was a time, because Vancouver Island came in with that descending plate, when the descending plate was on this side of Vancouver Island.
Well, here we go. We better step off here before we get...
And what happened to the San Juan? As the plate submerged, it dragged down little islets and volcanic islands, on the surface. But some of them didn't actually descend right into the mantle. They sort of popped up because they're lighter rocks. And so you get this complete mixture of different aged rocks and from different locations. And it's one of the most complicated.
So it makes the detective work a little trickier.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
I love the thing I like about this is I think many people who drive by or don't have a care about geology look and go, oh geez, they stabilize this bank with concrete. Right?
No. These are rocks you won't see anywhere else on Gabriola. This is quartzite, and it's obviously well rounded, and it's hundreds of millions of years older than Gabriola rocks.
Yes.
And quartzite is actually a metamorphic rock, which is quite rare on Gabriola. What it is very ancient sand. The mineral in sand, no matter what kind it is, that persists is quartz. All the other feldspars and so on eventually weather out over a very long period. So what you're left with is pure quartz sand. Mm-hmm. But this was what this was originally. But it's been very heavily compressed. It's been dragged down, cooked and generally processed to make quartzite. So it's almost solid quartz. And you do find these on one or two of the islands on the San Juan. So
yeah, that's because of that, it's a very dense, solid, weighty rock for its size. Like that's about the size of a softball.
So when this was laid down, it was very, very close to the mountains. Probably the San Juans were mountainous at the time, because the Olympic Peninsula wasn't there. That came much later. So the San Juan Islands were probably hilly, at least, very high hills, mountainous. And this is the debris from the San Juan Islands. So this is these are American rocks, mainly quartz, but there are other volcanic rocks in there.
Here is Gabriola musician Mike Swallow with River Rocks off his debut CD released in 2021 called Fortune is the Smile. Thanks to Mike Swallow. What a fabulous meditative groove he lays down. It's perfect for pondering the eons of time. And you can find and buy his album on the Bandcamp website, and I posted a link on this show's notes. And all the proceeds from the sale of that album, or the songs from that album, will support the BC Rainforest Preservation nonprofit called Pacific Wild. Here we are at Whalebone Beach now, with tails of glaciers rolling over and pushing down Gabriola, dumping rocks and gouging out what is now the Salish Sea. I think many people's favorite beach to walk on because of the, this little kaleidoscope of color and type that you see on Whalebone. And
well, if you're studying mainland, it's the way their geology, this is not a bad place to start without actually going on a ferry. Because the ice has, of course, brought it down from Hull Sound right here and dumped the rocks here. There were actually 3 glaciations on Gabriola, but the first one from the Nanaimo Lakes area is left hardly any remains. We only know about it because of stria in the rocks, that it came from the Kennedy Lakes area. The biggie, of course, was the one that gouged out this state of Georgia. But then subsequently, there was a big ice cap developed over the continent there, and the ice was actually sweeping across here, just ignoring the island and Vancouver Island. And so a lot of these rocks are from the coast there. And there are 2 different kinds of rocks. The ones from Vancouver Island, its origin was oceanic. It was an archipelago of volcanoes, a bit like the Caribbean, way over the other side of the Pacific. And the rocks from the mainland, of course, are continental rocks from the coast mountains. And they're quite different rocks. And so you've got them all here. As you can see, they're all rounded. Now, part of that's going to be rounding on the beach, but they were probably rounded when they were first picked up by the ice too. They takes a long time to round off some of these rocks. So it's probably where the ice swept down an old creek bed, and picked up all the creek bed rocks and just brought them over here. The dull-looking ones. These are from this is basalt.
Okay.
And this is all from Vancouver Island. And so this rock started life deep down in the mantle somewhere, thousands of miles from here, and welled up into a type. The volcanic islands are very gentle. The mid-island ridges, which is where the source of the plates spreading is.
Right. Yeah.
This comes really very deep down in the earth. And this is a very continuous process. It was quite alarming when geologists first discovered that there are no oceanic rocks older than about 200 million years, which is quite a puzzle because before that it was thought that the ocean rocks were just flooded mainland rocks, just the same. These rocks are 200 million, very old. It's not average, 200 million years old, whereas on the continents, the Canadian Shield and Australia, we've got rocks approaching 4 billion years old, 200 times older. And this caused quite a dilemma to the geologists of the time, trying to explain why this was so. Why are the oceanic rocks so different from the continental rocks? And of course the answer was continental spreading, that the continents are made up of scum, as it were, on top of this slowly circulating the mantle rocks from the Earth's interior. But on top of that is sitting the scum, which are the lighter rocks, usually lighter in colour too, which are very rich in silica and aluminum, and very lighter rocks, and they sit and they drift around like continental drift, the story. And all of these rocks are the continental rocks.
right.
This is from the mainland, and it's full of feldspars, which have a lot of aluminum in them, and it's it's saturated in silica, whereas this is not. This has got lots of iron in it.
Right.
And magnesium, and it's quite a different rock, as you can see.
Yeah, so the classic salt and pepper rock that we always call.
And the other big difference is these, you can't see, well, you've got to ignore this surface stuff, but you can't see the crystal structure of these, which indicates that it crystallizes very, very rapidly, which is what they typically do. Beneath the ocean, they come up as a magma, and once they reach the surface of the Earth's surface, not the ocean surface, they cool extremely rapidly, and so you don't get crystal growth. Mm-hmm. Whereas these guys sat underneath, percolated up very slowly, and had time to think about life and so on. And they're much more interesting, of course, because you can actually identify all the different kinds of minerals that come out of them at different temperatures and so on. It's a very slow process, which is ongoing right now. As we look at these mountains, they're being pushed up, and underneath is magma, which is cooling very, very slowly and developing this crystalline structure. There is a third kind of rock we see here. We don't see very many metamorphic rocks, but what we do see is, as he's looking around desperately, is what we call metasomatic rocks. And metasomatic rocks are like metamorphic rocks. You understand, metamorphic rock is a rock that's been melted and by pressure and altered completely from its original state. Whereas a metasomatic rock is one which has been immersed under very high pressure in very hot water. And so it doesn't actually melt the rock, but it changes the crystals in the rock. And because this is the junction of lots of volcanism, in the coast mountains here and the ocean, you get lots of water gets dragged down as the plate sinks. The Pacific floor of the Pacific Ocean sinks. It drags down with a lot of water, and eventually this water gets very, very hot and wants to get out of here and moves up to the surface, and it changes the nature of the rocks when it gets very, 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 very hot under pressure, and you get these sorts of things.
Right.
Some of these minerals are probably metamorphic rocks, epidote, but then you get these quartz veins. But you can see what this rock has been done to, if that's English. It's been soaked in enormous pressure and temperature. It has to be under pressure, of course, otherwise it'd just boil off. But very hot fluid, and it's changed the nature of the minerals in it. And these are very more common than metamorphic rocks, and they're metasomatic rocks.
Metasomatic rock.
Metasomatic.
And the classic look is this, where it's like a marbling kind of an effect almost.
And the giveaway is green.
Oh, okay.
The green can come from various minerals, but commonly it's epidote, which is actually a metamorphic type mineral. But the other one is chlorite, which is a clay, and it's green. It's nothing to do with chlorine, but chlorite is green, and it's a very, very common mineral that develops under those special conditions, hot water under pressure. So people sometimes ask, what do geologists call these green rocks? And what they call them is green rocks.
Yeah. Well, that's good. It's accessible to the masses that way, right? They're green rocks.
And so a lot of this green coloration is where it's been partially mineralized to chlorite,
right,
which is a clay. Most of this grey stuff is basalt, and it's there because it's a very, very hard rock. It's full of iron, and it weathers very, very slowly compared to other rocks, and so it's made a bigger contribution to the assembly. but the colour is just a rind. You know, inside it's just grey.
Right.
And these little patches of quartz, you know, this is where this is all contact stuff. It's contact between the oceanic rock of Vancouver Island and the silica-rich rock of the continent, and so this will be quartz or something like that.
That's just kind of fused on over.
Yeah.
So accounting for the variation in color here, it just comes down to different levels of melting and weathering.
Yeah. See, here's another contact rock. Look at that, you've got an intrusion of quartz there.
Right.
Into probably a basalt basic rock, but no, don't be fooled by that. But, yeah. But you've got these metamorphic, probably traces of epidote, which is a rock that forms in these particular. It only forms in these particular types of situation. But it's the collision of North America with the Pacific Ocean. You know.
Yeah. And so we get the mix here. This is the great the mixing pot is right here.
So you've got all the rocks from over there, and you've got all the rocks from over there too.
Yeah. So ponder that the next time you're down on Whalebone Beach, walking on the cobblestones. You're striding over rocks from the continent, from Pangaea, and from Vancouver Island by way of the South Pacific. We can't end our rock tour without a stop here. And for all of us that sit under here and sun ourselves and go swimming, why did this happen? Why did the formation erode like it did? Nick unlocks the grand illusion of the Malaspina Galleries.
The wind and the waves was when I started researching this, actually, 20 years ago now. And I looked at this place and said, well, is this really windy? And if you want to see these formations, then you should go to somewhere where it's really windy. Would you choose to come here? Oh, I don't think so. And then the second, it's the waves. It's been called by the waves, and you can tell it's the waves because you can see all the barnacles and seaweed here. You know.
Yeah. There's none. Right. Yeah.
And then it gets lost in mystery. But the first clue that as to what causes this are these things. Some people call them tophony, and some people call them honeycomb rocks. There are an array of small holes in the sandstone. But what you notice about them, if you look at them, is that they're not random. There's a pattern to them. They're equally spaced. And so this is an indication that gave me the clue that this can't be caused by an external force. You know, it's a property of the rock itself.
Right.
You couldn't put random splashes and get a pattern like that. And then the question is, well, what is the mechanism? And if you look at the debris, if you look at some of the debris,
so just kind of a little bit of loose, flaky sandstone.
Yeah, this is actually the clay that holds the sandstone together. What you find very often is on the interior of this flaky clay is salt, and that's what's causing it. It's the salt. If you make sandstone, you've got to have something to cement the grains of sand together. You can't make sandstone out of sand just by compressing it. It's got to have a cement. And there are various different kinds of minerals that can act as a cement. And on Gabriola, ours is held together mainly by clay. That's the cement, and that's what you see here. Grains of sand have dropped away, and they've left the cement. If you analyze this,
right,
it's clay.
It's clay, the flaky material that's constantly sloughing off.
Yeah, the basic mechanism is that the sandstone is fairly porous, and so any salt water, and it can be just rain, it doesn't have to be very salty, with sea spray, soaks into the sandstone. And then when the sun comes on it, and another thing you'll notice is that these things always form facing the sun. There's none over there in the shade there. So what happens is you've got this salty water that's soaked into the sandstone, and then the sun shines on it, which draws it out. And as it draws it out, it evaporates and leaves behind the salt. And the salt crystallizes, and in the process of crystallization, it doesn't like being confined to it's got a particular shape, a salt crystal, right. And it doesn't like being confined by the grains, and so it puts pressure on the grains. And this loosens up the clay, and the clay gets washed out, and that creates a hole. Now, once you've got a hole, imagine this is the interior of the rock here, and this is the surface. Once you've got a hole, any water that's moving towards the surface as the evaporation surface preferentially goes to the bottom of the hole, because that's the easiest escape route.
Yeah, path of least resistance.
Yes, and so the hole gets deeper.
Right.
And the other thing it does is that the surrounding area around the hole gets deprived of salt. You've got a hole here, two holes here, but the in-between space is not getting any salt, so it stands proud, and you can see examples here where that rim
is a little higher up.
You see?
Yeah. So is a gallery just a giant honeycomb? Nick breaks it down.
Okay, so what makes this huge hole here? Well, this one is not relying so much on random rainfall, it's containing a little bit of sea spray, not that particularly salty, but there's a fault here. This is a fracture zone.
Right.
And so you can see where water is actually seeping down that fracture and bringing a fresh supply of salty water to the behind this wall here.
This is the process of the gallery's creation in action right here, where we see the water coming down like that.
Yeah. And it's a pump. Okay, the sun is then pumping that water out and causing all this weathering. And you've just got the shell there. That's it.
And over how many millennia or millions would you think that this would take?
Okay, no, you
can get to this huge
You can get
space?
a good idea of that, because what people used to do when people first started coming here in the early 1900s, there were actually tourist trips from Nanaimo came over, and people, of course, drew their names, put graffiti on them, and what happens is whatever they use it, paint or something like that, it stops the evaporation, so it stops the erosion, and so over the years it becomes more and more prominent, and eventually it disappears. Now you can look at pictures and figure out how fast the face is eroding, 4 or 5 millimeters a year.
Yeah.
So you can figure out this maybe 2,000 years, something like that. But that's pretty rough. Yeah. Something like that. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Now the only other thing. So why is the roof there? Why do we have a roof here?
Right over our.
Yeah. Well, the sandstone basically ground up. Granodiorite, basically, from the close mountains, and so it has iron in it. These iron minerals in it, and they rust. As they weather, because of the iron, they form hematite and limonite. Those are very, very good cements. So the sandstone that's being heavily weathered gets rusty, basically, and that cements it and makes it very hard, and so it erodes much more slowly than does the parent rock. And that's what the roof is. This is case-hardened sandstone. This is in the Spanish drawing.
Yeah. The big...
This is the original, part of the original outline of the cliff here.
Ah, okay, so that's our remnant of the original cliff then. We always used to call this the epiglottis.
Right.
Malaspina's epiglottis.
And you can see the rims here. That's a beautiful example, a textbook example of the rims around the holes, which are deprived of salt.
Yeah.
In the summer, it's ideal because what happens is the high tides are at night in the summertime, and which then gives it a nice coating of salt, and then in the daytime the tides are low, and the low tides are perfect for evaporating the water, so the process is, this is an ideal spot
to see it really
for
accelerate.
drawing the salt being drawn to the surface and then being crystallized and breaking down the sandstone.
Ultimately, what would be the final story for the
roof will collapse.
Yeah, it will happen at some point, whether it's a tectonic activity that just shakes it loose or time and erosion.
One time, the RDN unsuccessfully tried to close it down. They put notices up.
I remember.
I did some risk analysis, just for fun, but analysed the risk of you being killed by standing here and compared it with the risk you run if you drove your car to Whistler. And it turned out driving your car to Whistler is way more dangerous than standing here.
It's probably why most of us who lived here used that sign as a towel rack.
Yeah.
And we just climbed over and came here anyway.
Yeah.
They took it down. I can't remember how long it was up for, but it didn't stay long.
No,
they could tell that there was going to be no compliance. I want to thank Nick Doe for shedding light on the island's geology, and thank you for listening. I'm your host, Ken Gurr. Bye for now.
The kids were really very good at that.
Yeah.
They always come back with some magnificent specimens.
Oh, well, they're closer to the ground.
Yeah.
That's what I always say. Kathy, she goes out on her nature walks with her kindergarten students, and they find everything. Because I said, I said, well, they're less than a meter from the ground. No wonder.
Yeah, they are really good.